Look at those special gloves you have, Ben.
This bearing is absolutely cooking. So it's about 100 degrees and I can handle it with these gloves, and that surface has been cleaned, so we just want to slide that over and should just go straight on. Oh, geez, we're gonna have to check that. I think that diameter might be a little bit big.
Too tight?
Too tight. So when you do this kind of work and you go to slide the bearing on, you have to make a big commitment. You're either going to go all the way, or if it gets stuck, you're coming back. We haven't barely got on there, so that's coming back. Oh, geez,
are you going to be able to get it?
Oh, that'll come off. 34.9 on that bearing surface there. Yes. 34.95. What we do is set it right up, get it back to temperature again, sit it on there, and then just tap it and make sure it goes down.
Yeah.
We'll need a sleeve for there so that we don't damage that section, because the tube is bigger than that section, so we'll just stand it up off the cage there. Slide it back down. So I'll put this back in the
back on the oven.
Back on the heat plate. So the tolerances are okay. They're right on the maximum limit of interference, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. We just got to make sure that we get it home in one sort of go. So we need to turn up a little bit of a tool so that we don't foul on the cage of the taper roller. And it needs to be 35 on the inside and 42.5 on the outside, with a bit of a step to clear the cage. Clean up the surface, and so far we're at 42.5, so 42.2, so that's pretty much there already.
Beautiful.
That's good. So we'll just change over to the boring bar. Okay, round two. Let's get the bearing.
It looks too good to be even in a workshop.
For the bearing, we've got our little tool and a drift. So let's go.
Let's go drifting.
Let's drop the bearing down.
Laugh if it just dropped on that time.
Oh, that would be nice.
Send it.
Imagine without the heating.
Dude, I wouldn't have even attempted that without heating.
But yeah,
even then I was worried that wasn't going to go on.
On a press as well, that would have gone on. You wouldn't have had any feel like pushback from it.
Yeah.
So now you'll find the heat's sucking into the to the main shaft. Down here it'll start warming up.
Ooh, fuck.
What did you say?
I didn't believe it was hot. Sorry.
Just as it's cooling down, we'll just keep giving it a tap now and then, just to make sure it stays seated. Yeah.
All right, so we'll let that cool, and then we can mock it up in the vehicle.
Yeah, so we'll check the diff housing now and press in the cup for the bearing. So tell us what you found.
Well, this is only a tiny bit of it, but if you come here, hopefully you can see where the axle tubes, there's a gap between where they weld into the diff center housing in here. Regardless if you have one or not, it's always good to check in there. So we put a fair bit of, like, in fairness, it's probably not going to make it into the center, but especially with nice expensive current track.
That's that right.
Yeah, it's just glitterati everywhere.
Shiny sparkles.
Mr. Sparkle. So yeah, you do not want it in your diff. Alright, so we're just going to press this inboard bearing cup in. Make sure you put the shim in first. You'll be very, very pissed off if you press that in and forget to put in the shim. I'm a poet and I didn't know it.
Oh, you knew it.
Yeah, I was waiting for that moment.
So it's quite hard to hear when it's a seat at home. So we're pretty sure we've tapped at home, and what we're doing is just grabbing a 30 or 40 micron feeler blade. You can see it's pretty thin, and just reaching in behind and making sure that
the old reach around.
The old reach around.
Alright, so we're ready to put the pinion in. There you go, you can see the new bearing cup is in with the shim behind it. Remember, the case is nice and cleaned out too, no more metal shavings.
So that is 14.4.
And then deduct the thickness.
Plus 2.8. So 14.4 plus 2.8 is 17.2. 17.2, and we wanted 19.5. So we need over 2 mils to be taken off that face.
Who guessed 2 mils?
You guessed 2 mils.
Fuck, I'm good.
Just ask you. So let's try that.
Another adventure to the lathe.
The lathe. So we measured.
So obviously the average Joe isn't going to have a nice lathe like this at home. So you could do it with a grinder, taking a lot of care. Would you recommend that, Ben?
Well, a man's got to do what a man's got to do. If you do use a grinder, be really careful not to overheat the gear, and take really light passes with it to clean it up.
And speaking about overheating, I don't know if we mentioned with the bearings, you don't want to get them hotter than 100 degrees really.
Typically you don't want to go any hotter than 100 degrees because the temperature stability of the bearing for normal heat treatment is about 120. So give yourself a little bit of margin. Heat it up to 100. If you need to go any more, or you need to have a bigger difference, then you want to start looking at cooling the shaft and things like that.
Yeah.
And making sure your tolerances are right.
Yeah. Alright. So as you can see here, we just wrapped some blue lecky tape around here just to stop any swarf getting in these roller bearings. So we've just put a new cutting point tip on. So because we can't measure from this face, because the tape's there obviously, here's a little trick to check your size. Basically a little straight edge across the pinion gear face back to the boss on the lathe.
And it works out to be exactly 115 plus or minus, so that'll do.
Easy. So we're looking for 113.
113, alright, you remember?
Or 112.8.
Yeah. You remember the magic number?
Is that definitely right? It was
13, 14, 15.
No, we need 2.8.
Just going to do it in stages and let it cool down in between.
Oh fuck. No fires this time, Benny.
No, mate.
Yeah, we kind of cleaned that out. Alright, so it is down to the right width now. All we're going to do now is just splay the start of that helix angle, and we've guesstimated it to be about 10 degrees, which Ben is now setting up on the lathe. So you can see the 10-degree angle that we put on there. It's pretty much the same as the back side of the pinion gear, which will be used when it's in reverse. So it's just a matter of deburring now, all in here, thoroughly cleaning it, then we can mock it up in the car, hopefully for good. Alright guys, so I don't know if we mentioned before, but we are going to end up running the bearings that came off the diff center, just because they're pretty fresh and they're in really good nick, and it also saves us running the risk of having to shim when we don't have extra shims. So it's one thing to obviously inspect, and based on what Ben has explained previously in the video about inspecting bearings,
Yep.
give you guys a decent idea about deciding whether or not to run them again. We do have some new ones in the box, but for the sake of wasting another few hours and potentially...
Yeah, the issue is that the tolerance from this face to the other face, which is the dimension T in the catalogue, has quite a large variation on it. So if we change the bearings when we put it all back in, there's a chance that we'll need different shims, substantially different shims that we don't have tonight. So given that the bearings are in reasonable condition, our best bet is to put them back, and then they'll be in the same position, and we can shim for backlash and that sort of thing, but we won't have to do a major adjustment for a different dimension in that T.
Alright.
This assembly, the old bench press. There she sits there. So what we've done is we've put them in with no shims at all, and then just hold that there, and we'll slide the shims in. Move that way. So these shims have a chamfer, and the chamfer heads towards the outside. So remembering to keep the same sides at the same size.
Yep.
So there's the centre pop and there's the centre pop mark. And of course facing the right way.
You know what we should do? We should mill some billet ones. Seems like we've got so much time. I don't like the look of those cast ones.
Good luck with that.
We'll just fire up the CNC machine and...
Yep.
We reckon titanium?
I think so. I reckon titanium. I reckon what we should do is make it out of unobtainium.
I was going to say.
Unobtainium, just like our short extension. So what we're going to do is nip the bearing caps up, torque it up, and then check the preload on the carrier bearings. Because we don't have the pinion in at the moment, so it's going to spin freely. It's purely for the bearing preload. So the total amount of shim we put in this assembly here.
Yeah.
So increasing the shims will increase the preload on the outboard side, pushing the cups closer together. Here's your calibration certificate. Can't work under these conditions. So one click on the torque wrench, or approximately 1.5 on the old dugger.
Right, so I'm sure a lot of you guys now are probably wondering, what the fuck are you guys doing? So do you want to enlighten everyone, Ben?
Yeah, it's good luck, bro. It's like a dream catcher.
Yeah, we're gonna wind that up, leave it in there.
Yep, nice and tight. Now what we're going to do is check the bearing preload. So there's the scale, and basically the torque spec is about 18 Newton meters rolling torque. So what I'll do is hook up this pre-calibrated scale, hook it up to this, and we measure the force that it takes to keep this assembly rotating. And then we take the force combined with that radius or diameter and convert it into a torque. So torque, Newton meters, is force times distance. So we're measuring force, and we know the distance from the diameter of the diff carrier.
This shit is extreme.
So the trick is having a nice smooth pull. It may take us a few times to get right, but it was about 1 kilo. So we'll do it a couple of times and make sure we have it right. That was about 1 kilo force.
Yeah. So you're pretty much just checking the friction or the preload on the bearings.
Yeah, so
by the drag, I guess.
Yeah, so technically preload is normally, I need a place to hang this. Yeah. So preload is actually defined in millimeters.
Yep.
Preload. But when you have an assembly like this, you can experimentally determine what the rolling friction is going to be. And that, for many people, is a lot easier to measure than actual preload. So there's a couple of things that are variable in that, and that's the bearing type and design, the type of lubricant that you use, and so on. So if you keep it as close as possible to factory, then that rolling torque is not going to be too far away. Well, you're not going to get into trouble running it. So we'll do it a couple of times and make sure that we get a consistent reading, and then we'll do a little bit of maths to work out what the actual torque is. So for the moment, all we need to do is just note down what the force is on the rope as we pull it. So we want a nice consistent rolling motion. That's why I've got plenty of rope, because there'll be an initial friction to overcome to get it turning, and that'll show as a higher peak force initially, and then it'll settle down. You'll have a constant force as it's rolling.
Yep.
So we're accepting the preload tolerance being slightly below what's stated in the book. Part of that is because of the gauge that we're using. It's about 1/2 kilo, but also when you consider how the bearing assembly works and what happens to the clearance under increased temperatures, it'll make a bit more sense. So first off, let's establish some fundamentals. So in a bearing assembly like this, the inner race is turning, and that race there will run hotter than the outer race. So what will happen is that's running hotter, and that will increase in diameter due to temperature more than the outside. So something is going to happen with the clearances. So if we have a look at this particular assembly, these two outer rings go like that, around here. And they have an inclined raceway surface. So taking the left side, which is this side, let's consider what happens when this assembly heats up. So when it heats up, it's going to grow in the radial direction and in the axial direction. So if we consider only the growth in the radial direction for a moment, given that the incline is going in this way, if we had a bearing, if we have the bearing growing on the inner ring in the radial direction this way, what's going to happen to the clearance? Take the same example, so it's considering this side here, the bearing sits in like that. Now if this bearing was to grow only in this direction, what would happen to the clearance in this bearing assembly?
Yeah, so the inner race will expand and obviously push the rollers into
harder against the outer race.
Yeah.
Okay, so what's going to happen there is the clearance in the assembly is going to reduce. Okay, so now let's consider what happens due to thermal expansion axially, so in the axial direction, so this way. So as this whole assembly heats up, what's going to happen to the clearance in this assembly? This inner race is going to move more that way, and what will happen to the clearance?
You'll get less.
It will reduce.
Yes.
But what happens is it doesn't grow in this dimension and this dimension independently, it happens simultaneously. So it's going to grow this way, and the clearance in the whole assembly will reduce. So what happens is, even though we've started out a little bit on the low side, if we happen to have a greater temperature difference into this assembly, for instance running thicker oils or driving it a lot harder, we'll have a higher temperature rise from when we assembled it to when it's running in operation, and in which case the preload will increase or the clearance will decrease.
Yeah.
They're the same thing. So what's going to happen is, if we introduce more heat into this by, say, driving it harder and so on, what's going to happen is it's going to grow more in the axial direction and the radial direction, reducing the clearance. So it's probably a good thing that we've started on the lower side of the preload clearance. Because this is just a mild steel ring, in the short time that you've had this in operating, it's worn a ridge here. So for these bearings, this dimension here was the right dimension. It would have given the right preload according to the book. But in operation, this surface here has worn down, which has allowed the outer rings to move further apart and increase the clearance, or reduce the preload that's in the bearing assembly. It's quite common to use just mild steel rings like this, but this is one of the risks that you run. So if you're really trying to ensure that your diff stays exactly how it was when you set it up, then these rings really need to be hardened and surface ground so that you alleviate some of this wear.
Alright, well that tech tip brought to you by Spicer.
But you had to pay for that. Yeah. So that top tip was brought to you by Bengineered.
Alright, so we've just mocked the, get my camera in there, just mocked the pinion up, just with some spacers and the nut, because the flange is going to be pretty tight to put on, so we only want to do that once, hopefully. Now it's time to put the center back in. So after tightening up the bearing caps, this is when you test if you've bear in mind, this is only if you got the Harrop True Track or any aftermarket. I'm guessing the cows will probably be the same.
Anything that has a large body here.
Yeah. So that's the only reason why I've had to machine the pinion shaft. So don't get that confused with just using a regular single spinner or LSD. You won't have to do that. But in our case, and I do highly recommend getting one of these because it makes a massive difference. And they're very strong and reliable. But yeah, we've basically tightened up the bearing caps and found that it is indeed binding on the diff center.
So that's bound up on there. We've only just nipped up the cap, so what I'll do is just release that and just pull it outwards a little bit, and now we've freed up some motion.
Yep.
So it really is binding up on there.
So what do you think? Another?
So probably about
mil and a half?
Yeah, at least a mil. Probably even 2 mils to make sure that we've got clearance and then some.
Yeah.
Because like we're talking about with the thermal expansion, it is also going to grow this way. And the carrier is also going to grow.
And you did actually point out that you saw some teeth contact marks on the
these
center.
look like teeth contact marks on the center. Possibly from when it's running really, really hot. We machined the distance of that pinion to be very, very close to this pinion. But we did have some difficulties getting exactly the right measurement because of the way the cage of the inner ring here sits up against there. So that's the reference surface there, in here. And that's where the bearing abuts to, so we measure from there to the front face.
Yep. And we took off how much? 2.5?
2.7 mils,
yep.
Pretty much. And when we measure on here, it looks like we need to go even further. So the other pinion roughly matches this. It's a little bit taller, which is probably why in here it's only just binding, whereas this one was okay. And then you can see just the slightest hair of rubbing on the True Track.
Yep. So, alright, so back to the lathe.
Back to the lathe.
So we've got this all deburred. As you it probably won't focus. It's been a real bitch, that thing.
No, it's in focus.
Wow, it's cooperating. So it's all deburred. You want to basically be able to run your finger along that line and have it roll over nicely. Yeah, both faces are burred, or deburred I should say. And I must say, a beautiful machining job by you, Benjamin. Nice bit of lathe work. Okay, so we've just put the diff center back in for what we hope was the last time, just to check backlash and everything. So at the moment, with it not torqued down, it feels pretty normal.
Oh, there's quite a lot of backlash, but yeah, so we have the bearing seat sitting quite a way out of the seat. So we're just having a feel, so there's quite a lot of backlash there. And as we tap the bearing races in a little bit further, you can feel the backlash reducing. So we just keep tapping it in a bit more. There's essentially zero backlash there. And now I'm
Yeah,
turn.
now she's bound. So what's happening, basically the pinion is bottomed out in this tooth, is that right? We think?
Yeah, so we suspect at the moment that the pinion, we remember that shim that we installed that was there from before?
Make sure you put the shim in first. You'll be very, very pissed off if you press that in and forget to put in the shim.
That's probably causing the pinion to sit too far out, and being too far out, the engagement is going all the way into the root of the tooth.
Yep.
As we,
which it's not designed to do.
Yeah, so we have to pull it all out, take the pinion out, take that shim out, reset it back, push this home again as we did, and to see if it clears up the issue.
This is just a reminder of what kind of work goes into setting up a diff properly. A lot of guys think you can just swap these in, slap them in, but the reality of it is, I guess it may work. It might not last as long, or you'll have a catastrophic failure or massive decrease in bearing life. Would you agree?
Yeah, sometimes you might get lucky and it all goes in and it's pretty much where the other set was. Other times like this, we have to rework the whole thing from the beginning. And part of that is because we've got a new crown wheel and pinion. It's an aftermarket product. So we have to set it up from scratch and make sure that all the parameters are right so that we get decent life out of it. Because particularly with a diff center like this, that's a Torsen style diff with all the worm gears inside. If you do have a failure and you get all these metal particles going through it, it's really not good for the diff.
No.
So yeah, we'll try to get it right from the beginning.
We will. I have faith, Ben.
You have faith, but do you have time?
I've got all the time. I've got all tomorrow.